They called me Omar at the border. That wasn't my name. It belonged to a man who drowned 3 months before the boat came for me. I carried his papers, his birth, his death, and my chance to live. Europe didn't want me, a refugee with nothing left but prayers. It wanted someone official, someone with a name that passed. Every checkpoint felt like a confession with no priest, every question a test of my borrowed soul. But the hardest border wasn't made of fences or soldiers. It was waking up each morning, remembering that the world believed I was someone else. I used to think a name was a simple thing, a word that followed you like a shadow. In Syria, my mother used to say, "Your name is the only inheritance you can't sell." She said it while boiling lentils during blackouts, her voice trembling under the hum of warplanes. But when the bombs took the street where our house used to stand, I learned something else. Even names can burn. Mine did, buried somewhere under concrete and silence. When I left Aleppo, I wasn't running from death. I was running from the space it left behind. My father was gone. My brother disappeared in a prison we were told not to name. I had no documents, no proof that I had ever existed. At the first checkpoint near Idlib, a smuggler looked at me, my empty hands, and said, "You're lucky. The sea doesn't care who you are, only who you can pretend to be." He was right. Omar's passport was found on the floor of a drowned dinghy. His cousin couldn't bear to destroy it, so he sold it to a man with a satellite phone and no mercy. That man sold it to me. In those days, mercy had a price, and it was always higher than you could afford. The photograph didn't match perfectly. The beard helped. Same brown eyes, same hesitation in them. I practiced the signature until it looked natural, not perfect, but confident enough to fool a border guard in the dark. At the crossing, the officer squinted at the ID. "Omar Khalil?" he said. "Yes," I answered, before realizing how easily it came out. It was like slipping into someone else's skin and finding it warm. On the boat, the wind spoke in a dozen accents: Somali, Afghan, Eritrean, Kurdish. Everyone had their own version of loss. A child cried for his mother's scarf. A man kissed a photograph wrapped in plastic. I had only the passport, hidden in a bread bag, the corners still damp from another man's death. When the waves grew violent, I held it tighter than I ever held a prayer. That night, I made a promise to Omar, to live the life he didn't. But promises made at sea don't always survive the shore. Europe smelled of wet asphalt and bureaucracy. They processed us like livestock: fingerprints, questions, numbered bracelets. Every question felt like a small interrogation. Birthplace, father's name, occupation. I spoke Omar's answers as if reading scripture. I told them about his village, his father the baker, his mother's arthritis. The officer smiled politely and stamped the page. Just like that, I existed again, as someone else. That first night in the camp, I stared at the ceiling and whispered my real name, just once, to remember what truth sounded like. But the walls didn't echo it back. It felt like a crime to say it aloud. And crimes, I'd learned, are best buried under silence. The next morning, they called roll. "Omar Khalil?" I raised my hand. For a moment, the world didn't fall apart. For a moment, I was free. They told us to think of the camp as a reception center. It felt more like a waiting room for a life that was never going to call our name. Still, hope makes tight spaces feel larger. I learned the bus schedule, the distribution hours, the fastest line for showers. I learned how to be invisible to the board guards and visible to the volunteers who came with clipboards and shining eyes. One of them, a woman with a wool hat and a quiet voice, asked, "How are you today, Omar?" I answered in careful syllables, "I am fine." The sentence felt like a new pair of shoes, stiff but mine. Language classes were my first door. They placed us in a prefab classroom that smelled of marker ink and damp coats. We learned words like appointment, document, temporary. Our teacher asked us to introduce ourselves. "My name is Omar," I said, and the class repeated it. O-Mar, assembling a life around the sounds. After class, I stood by the window and practiced vowel shapes on the glass, watching my breath fog and clear. The world on the other side waited in tidy lines and printed schedules. A world of timetables felt merciful compared to the random math of bombs. My motive was simple at first: survive. Collect the right papers, find honest work, send money to my mother's cousin in Gaziantep who had taken in our last surviving aunt. I pressed each hope like a prayer bead between my fingers. "Why Europe?" the caseworker asked during my asylum interview. The room was bright and windowless, the fluorescent light buzzing like a trapped fly. I told her Omar's village story again. I told her the bakery burned down, that he wanted to study refrigeration in Germany because cold machines didn't explode. When she nodded, I felt relief and something else, a heat under the tongue, a quickness in the chest, desire. Not for money yet, not for pleasure, for reinvention. To walk down a street where no one knew the taste of my name and see if I could change the flavor. The first lie that wasn't required came when a volunteer asked what music I liked. Oud, I should have said, thinking of late nights in Aleppo when my father hummed as he mended a chair. But in the silence that followed her question, I heard my future treading water. "Indie rock," I said, a phrase I had learned from the boy in the bunk above me. She smiled. "You have great taste." It was a small lie, warm and easy, like stepping from shade into sunlight. No one died for that lie. No one would know. That is how it starts, not with greed, but with the relief of being believed. I got a day pass to the city for a medical appointment. Outside the tram window, Europe looked like a promise folded into rectilinear streets. Order everywhere. Glass storefronts reflecting clouds. Bikes parked at neat angles. A man walking a dog who looked like he paid taxes. For the first time since the sea, I felt the beat of normal life, steady and indifferent. I craved that indifference like water. At a charity shop, I bought a second-hand navy coat with shoulder seams that almost matched mine. I put it on and stood straighter. The mirror did not argue. In its surface, Omar looked like a man who could belong. Not the boy who left a street with no number because the number had been blasted into powder. Belonging is a quiet drug. It makes your pulse agree with the city's. In the evenings, we gathered around a cracked phone in the dorm and watched videos about work permits and interviews. We practiced shaking hands with invisible employers. A Sudanese man named Idris taught us how to answer the question, "What are your strengths?" "Reliability," he said, rolling the word on his tongue like candy. We repeated it until it tasted sweet. At the mosque in the warehouse district, the imam spoke about patience. He said, "Allah has 99 names. You need only one." I pressed my forehead to the prayer rug and asked for mercy for Omar, the real one. Then I asked for a small favor for the borrowed one I had become. Let me build a life that doesn't shame either name. Temptation arrived dressed as opportunity. A caseworker mentioned a food processing plant 2 towns away that hired people who were in transition. Long shifts, cold rooms, predictable pay. I pictured my father's burned bakery and imagined learning the machinery that makes cold behave. They needed a national ID number, I had one. It said I was Omar. On my first day, the factory air was clean and refrigerated, a square breath you could stack. I counted cartons, moved pallets, learned the choreography of fluorescent hours. The supervisor circled names on a schedule, ticking boxes with a noise that sounded like approval. At the end of the shift, we lined up for envelopes. Mine had a label with the name that passed. Money felt heavier than paper. On the bus back to the camp, I texted a cousin through a friend's account. I found work. He replied with a thumbs up and a blue heart. I stared at that icon like it was an amulet protecting me from drowning. With pay came small liberties. I bought a phone plan that let me speak to Gaziantep without counting seconds. I ordered coffee that tasted like burnt sugar and not like waiting. I tried a new word. Later. Later, I will find a room. Later, I will move to a quieter neighborhood. Later, I will send for my aunt. Later is the first luxury of safety. One Friday, a coworker named Anya invited me and two others to a bar near the station. I hesitated. I could hear my mother's voice, not scolding, simply practical. Your wages are a blanket, not a kite. But curiosity lifted the edge of that blanket. At the bar, everything glowed. Bottles aligned like stained glass. Laughter folded into the low music. I stood with my soda and watched Anya dance. Small, precise movements. A smile that said she knew the city, and it knew her back. When she asked my name, I said, Omar, and she repeated it like a note in a song. For a moment, I didn't feel like a thief. I felt like a guest. Temptation was never only about pleasure. It was about escaping the echo of who I had been. A man with a past too heavy to pack. Every time someone called Omar, I turned as if I had always owned the word. People can't see the seam where a borrowed life is stitched to the skin. They only see whether you wear it well. Soon, I found a room in a shared apartment with two other men from the camp. We hung our coats like flags on a single nail. I kept the passport in a blue envelope under the mattress, wrapped in a page torn from a dictionary. Believe, to accept as true, to trust the word of, to have confidence in. Some nights I took the paper out and traced the definition with my finger until the meaning felt numb. I wanted to be believed so badly that I started to forget the difference between being believed and being true. At work, the supervisor asked if I could take an extra shift. Someone called in sick, he said. Someone always calls in sick in a story right before the main character gets lucky. I said yes. The overtime pay moved me closer to the numbers I sent home. When my cousin texted that our aunt needed a new set of dental plates, I stared at the price and said, I can do this. I was making good on the only promise that survived the sea. My mosque friends teased me that I had become punctual like a train. I prayed the sunset prayer on my break, cupping warm air in my hands as if it were water. Faith is a name you wear on the inside, my mother used to say, but a name on the outside was what bought groceries. The first significant choice came with a form. Human Resources sent an email asking us to confirm our personal data for a longer contract. Address, birth date, legal status. I stared at the cursor blinking next to place of birth. Aleppo. Or the village from Omar's file. I typed the borrowed village, felt my stomach knot, then typed it again more slowly to make the letters behave. I pressed submit and waited for lightning. Nothing happened. The room stayed ordinary. The radiator clicked like a metronome. I learned how quiet sin can be when it is administrative. With the longer contract came a security card. It clicked doors open without asking questions. The click went straight to my bloodstream. Trust given to the name on the card. traveled up my arm and into my throat. It felt like standing in a cathedral of yes. Desire grew bolder, not for luxury, for erasure, for the power to edit my own life without leaving red marks. I bought a new pair of shoes that squeaked only a little. I let Anya teach me the word for favorites in the music app. I found I could like a song in the same way I could like a plausible story about myself, with a double tap and no consequences. I learned which jokes landed with my coworkers, which stories about my uncle's bakery made their faces soften. Every laugh was an endorsement of my fiction. One evening, I video called my cousin and angled the camera to show him the tiny kitchen of our apartment. "Look," I said, and panned across the second-hand pan, the single window, the basil plant Anya insisted would make the room smell like summer, even in winter. "It's good," he said, meaning, "You made a place." I did not tell him that legally the place belonged to someone who was not me. The city taught me a new etiquette. Carry yourself as if you expect the door to open. Things open for people who believe they belong. Belonging became a habit that was hard to quit. When I sent my first real remittance, I wrote a message with it. For winter, for the doctor, for sweets when you can. My aunt sent a voice note in return, breathless and proud. "May Allah protect you, my son," she said, using a word that wrapped me in fabric I thought I had lost. Guilt pricked, then softened into the feeling of being useful. Useful men are forgiven many things. The caseworker scheduled a follow-up interview to update my file. Her office had a plant that kept reaching for a window it could not find. She asked about my integration, work, housing, friends. I described the factory, the shared flat, the bar near the station where the music was never too loud. "Do you feel safe as Omar?" she asked, reading from her screen without lifting her eyes. "Yes," I said. My mouth moved before my mind could protest. I waited for her to question the way I said the name, like a weight I'd learned to carry on the good shoulder. She didn't. The interview ended with a stamp. I walked out lighter and heavier at once. The next temptation was ambition dressed as gratitude. The supervisor asked if I wanted to train on the calibration line, the precise work that required attention and trust. He said it could lead to a raise and later a permanent contract. Permanent. A word like a house you can live inside. I began to study manuals, memorize part numbers, dream in diagrams. In those dreams there were no borders, only thresholds. On payday, I bought train tickets to the coast and watched the sea from a polite promenade, all white railings and mothers pushing strollers. The water looked tamed, a blue sermon about civilization. I imagined dropping the borrowed passport into its mouth and walking away free. But freedom, here, was not a dramatic gesture. It was 1,000 small permissions, each requiring a reasoned lie. I put the passport back in my pocket and bought an ice cream. Vanilla. Safe as paper. Sometimes, at night, I still whispered my real name into the dark. It had become a private prayer, a petition no office could process. When I slept, I dreamed of two men walking down the same street, stepping in and out of each other's shadows. They never argued. That worried me. I wanted them to fight so I would know which one to feed. The last weeks before everything shifted, the city and I developed a routine that felt like mutual respect. I gave it my early mornings, my steady hands, my practiced answers. It gave me a bank account with numbers that grew, a gym membership with a photo that didn't look like a passport, a circle of acquaintances who called my name from across a room and meant me. Temptation had done its work. Escape was no longer running away. It was settling in. Near the end of winter, Anya asked if I wanted to come to her friend's birthday. She said there would be music and something called karaoke, which she pronounced like a dare. I almost said no. The apartment needed a new lamp. I needed sleep. But she tilted her head, and I recognized in her face the same expression I used to wear when asking fate for a small favor. Don't make me ask twice. I said yes. That night, I stood in a room with soft lights and people I barely knew, and I watched a screen fill with words I couldn't pronounce fast enough. They put a microphone in my hand. I laughed and pushed it away, then took it back. The song began with a single line that anyone could learn. "Say my name." The room chanted. I opened my mouth and gave them the one I had. They cheered for Omar, and something inside me stepped back from the edge, drunk on being welcomed. I walked home in cold air that tasted like iron and simplicity. On the stairwell, a letter waited under the door. It had no stamp, just my name, written in a hand that did not belong to anyone I knew. I unfolded the paper. The lines were neat. The message was short. We need to speak about Omar Khalil. The letter had no return address, just my borrowed name, written in a hand that trembled slightly, like the ink itself was nervous to meet me. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a bill maybe, a bureaucratic glitch. But when I opened it, the words sliced through every layer I had built to protect myself. We are looking for you. Please contact us regarding the family of Omar Khalil. My breath stopped before my mind could. My hands began to sweat through the paper. That night, I didn't sleep. The walls of my room seemed to breathe, expanding, contracting, until every shadow looked like a face waiting to accuse me. In the hum of the radiator, I could almost hear my mother's voice again, soft but unrelenting. Even if you change your name, your sins will know where to find you. She'd been right. I went to work the next morning as if nothing had happened. That's how denial works. It doesn't erase, it delays. The conveyor belts hummed, the boxes slid, the cold air pressed against my face like discipline. But every time the intercom buzzed, I froze. Every time someone said Omar, I turned too fast, as if the real one might be standing behind me. At lunch, Anya noticed. You look pale, she said. You okay? Just tired, I replied. The lie came easier now, smooth, practiced, a second skin tightening over the first. By the weekend, I convinced myself it couldn't be that family. Maybe it was a clerical thing, maybe someone else with the same name. There were many Omars after all, and names, I reminded myself, were just words. But deep down, I knew. I Googled Omar Khalil that night. The search filled with faces, none of them mine, until one image stopped me cold. A smiling young man, olive skin, sharp jaw, standing by a sea that looked too calm to keep secrets. The caption read, Remembering Omar Khalil, Lost at Sea, 2015. My chest caved in. He was real, and he was loved. The article described his mother in Lebanon, still waiting for a phone call that would never come. A sister studying medicine in Munich. A father who couldn't bring himself to cancel his son's Facebook account. And here I was, working, laughing, breathing, while his memory stood still. I felt like I'd broken into heaven with counterfeit papers. I closed the browser, but the guilt didn't turn off. It pulsed. That night, I met Anya at the bar again. I told myself I needed noise, the warmth of strangers, the soft treason of forgetting. The place buzzed with weekend laughter, with music thick enough to drown a conscience. She leaned across the table, hair falling into her face, and said, You never talk about your family, Omar. I almost choked on my drink. "Not much to tell," I said. "That's okay," she smiled. "Some people come here to forget." Her words landed like confession disguised as kindness. I wanted to tell her everything, that I was living on borrowed bones, that every paycheck was a prayer sent under false pretenses. But honesty felt like another form of suicide. Instead, I kissed her. The money came easy after that. Overtime hours, fewer questions. She helped me fill out forms for a longer visa. She said, "You're doing so well, Omar." I nodded, and guilt smiled quietly in my pocket like a folded knife. I began sending larger remittances home. It felt righteous, redemption through currency. My aunt's messages grew longer, full of blessings. I became the good son of a name that wasn't mine. But with each wire transfer, the lie deepened its roots. Faith turned into function. Good deeds became camouflage. Weeks passed. Then came the knock on the door. It wasn't police, not yet. Just a man in a brown jacket, polite, professional. He introduced himself as representing a family from Lebanon. He said they'd been looking for relatives of Omar Khalil who had entered Europe years ago. The blood drained from my face. He studied me, too carefully, too gently. "They just want to know what happened," he said. He handed me a business card. "Call if you know anything." I took it with shaking hands. He didn't press, he just left. Sometimes, mercy is the cruelest form of punishment. That evening, I sat by the window, card in hand, city lights trembling like old film. I imagined the sister, the one in Munich, still hoping her brother was somewhere safe, working, living. I could almost see her refreshing her inbox, waiting for a message that would never come. And I wondered, would she see me walking down a street and think, "He moves like my brother did"? I wanted to call. I wanted to tell them everything. But to speak would be to vanish. Omar would die twice, him and the version of him I had built. So I did what the desperate do. I worked harder. The factory became my penance. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. If I could drown the guilt in motion, maybe it would stop whispering. But silence is patient. It waits between shifts, between breaths, between names. One night, Anya found the letter under the mattress. She asked, "What's this?" I froze. "It's nothing," I said too fast. Her eyes narrowed, soft worry, not suspicion. She touched my arm. "Omar, if you're in trouble, I can help." I wanted to tell her the truth, but truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. And I was already living on borrowed breath, so I smiled and lied again. The next morning, I burned the letter in the sink. The smoke curled like a soul trying to leave. The smell stayed in the apartment for days. When Anya asked about it, I said, "Cooking mistake." She laughed, and the lie lived a little longer. The same bar, the same face, the same lie. He smiled slower now. The laughter came late. Money ran out, but shame stayed rich. When the truth came knocking, no one even turned down the music. The city kept moving, even when my world stopped. That was the first cruelty of safety. It doesn't pause for your conscience. I went to work. I lifted boxes. I laughed when expected. But something had cracked beneath the rhythm. Every motion felt mechanical, like I was mimicking a man who used to be alive. Sleep came late. Dreams came early. And in between, silence, thick as snow. The man in the brown jacket returned 2 weeks later. He waited near the factory gates, holding a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "Omar," he said. "My name, but not mine. We are tracing survivors from the 2015 shipwreck. The family just wants confirmation. I told him he had the wrong person. He studied me, that calm, unbearable politeness of someone who already knows. He reached into his pocket and unfolded a photograph. The real Omar stood beside a car, arm around his sister, grinning at a future he never met. "You look alike," he said softly. "Maybe that's why the border let you through." My throat closed. He didn't accuse. He understood. That was worse. I nodded, a small, dying motion. He slipped the photo into my hand. "Keep it," he said. "Maybe you need to remember who paid your fare." That night I couldn't work, couldn't eat. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the picture. Omar's face seemed to shift under the lamplight, half smile, half warning. He had lived a better version of my story. Same hunger, but honest hunger. I whispered, "I'm sorry. But apologies don't travel far when the person you owe is water and bone." Days blurred. I stopped showing up for extra shifts. I started walking at night. The kind of walks where you follow your thoughts until they lead you nowhere safe. Every streetlight looked like interrogation. Every reflection in a shop window, a ghost rehearsing my downfall. Anya noticed. "You're distant," she said. I wanted to tell her that distance was all I had left, the only thing keeping me from drowning in my own borrowed name. Instead, I said, "Just tired." Again, always that word, tired, because it hides everything and demands nothing. At the mosque, I sat at the back. The imam spoke of repentance, how God forgives the liar who confesses before the lie destroys him. His words hit me like stones, one after another. After prayer, I stayed behind, kneeling long after everyone left. But when I opened my mouth, the truth refused to come out. It had lived too long in the dark to survive the light. Then the letter came, the one I'd been waiting for without knowing it. An envelope from the immigration office, stamped in blue. Inside, re-evaluation of asylum case, identity verification required. It felt like a sentence written by fate itself. All my careful lies, my forged belonging, folded into official stationery. I could almost hear the smuggler's voice again. The sea doesn't care who you are. But Europe did, and it was calling my bluff. I didn't tell Anya. I packed a small bag, hid my phone, and went north by train. Each station name sounded like a farewell. I spent the nights in cheap hostels, the kind where nobody asks, because everyone there is running from something. Addiction, war, or the shape of their own reflection. I told myself I would cross another border, start again, a third name, a third life. But every map I looked at led back to the same place. My face. One night, I found myself by the sea again. The same gray horizon, the same indifferent tide. Waves whispered like old conspirators. I knelt, opened my wallet, and took out the photograph the man had given me. The real Omar smiled under moonlight, unbothered by my trembling hands. I tore the picture in half, then in quarters, then smaller, until guilt became confetti. But even as the pieces scattered, the wind seemed to say his name. Not mine, his. I slept on the beach that night. When dawn came, I woke with sand in my mouth and salt in my throat. For a moment, I forgot who I was supposed to be. It was peaceful. Then the world returned, with all its questions, its paperwork, its ghosts. I bought a one-way ticket inland. No plan, no future, just distance. But distance doesn't cure what follows you inside your skin. The borrowed name echoed everywhere, in train announcements, in my passport, in strangers calling across a platform. Omar, Omar, Omar. Until I started answering without thinking, as if repetition had finally made it true. By the time they found me, weeks later, in a shelter near the border, I was too tired to run. A quiet arrest. No sirens, no violence. Just two officers, one asking for identification, the other holding my eyes longer than necessary. I handed over the passport. It trembled between us. "Is this you?" he asked. I opened my mouth, but the truth and the lie collided halfway out. "I don't know anymore," I whispered. He looked at me, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. Then he nodded. "Let's find out." They took me in without cuffs. They offered water, warmth, the kind of mercy that hurts more than punishment. In the interrogation room, I signed my real name for the first time in years. The pen shook, the ink bled, but the signature held. I had returned to myself, and it felt like a kind of death. The detention center was quiet in the mornings. Too quiet. The kind of silence that made you hear yourself breathing and regret every sound you ever used to lie. They placed me in a small room with a metal bed, a table, and a window that refused to open. No guards shouted, no violence, just procedures, soft, precise, and utterly indifferent. That's what guilt sounds like in Europe. Paperwork, staplers, and polite voices saying your name wrong. The officer came every 2 days with new questions, not accusations, clarifications. He asked me to confirm dates, cities, people. Each answer was a dismantling. Piece by piece, I disassembled Omar Khalil until nothing was left but the stranger who stole his breath. "Why did you take his name?" he asked. I wanted to say survival, but that word had become too small for what I'd done. So I said nothing. He waited, then sighed. "You could have just said you were scared," he whispered. I looked up at him. "I was," I said. "But fear becomes habit. You stop noticing when it turns into deceit." He nodded like someone who had seen too many versions of me. "Write it down," he said. "Everything. In your own words." That night, I began to write. It was supposed to be a statement, but it became something else. A confession disguised as paperwork. The pen felt heavier than it should have, as if every word demanded a price. I wrote about Aleppo, the smuggler, the false passport, the sea. I wrote about Anya, about the letters, about the real Omar and the photograph. When I finished, I didn't sign with either name. I just wrote, "The man who borrowed a life to survive it." Weeks passed. The process took time. Identity verification, interviews, translators. They needed to know who I was, and so did I. Every morning I recited my real name quietly before breakfast, afraid I'd forget the sound of it again. At first, it felt foreign in my mouth, sharp, awkward. Then slowly, like a wound healing wrong, it began to belong. I wasn't free, but I was honest. And for the first time in years, those two things didn't feel like opposites. One afternoon, the same man in the brown jacket came back. He was no longer holding coffee. He carried a sealed envelope. Inside, a letter, handwritten, trembling across the page. It was from Omar Khalil's sister. I stared at her name on the paper like it was something sacred. The officer waited for me to open it. My fingers hesitated, afraid that forgiveness, if it came, would be worse than blame. I unfolded the page. Her handwriting was simple, careful. We heard about you, about what you did. I should hate you, but part of me can't. You carried my brother's name longer than the sea could. Maybe God sent you to finish his life for him. Please, live it well. The words blurred before I could finish reading. I pressed the letter to my chest, as if her forgiveness might leak through the skin. For the first time since the night on the boat, I cried, not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd borrowed too long. That evening, I prayed, not for salvation, not even for release, just to be remembered by my real name, somewhere beyond the noise of paperwork and lies. And in the silence that followed, I felt, faintly, as if someone else prayed with me. Maybe him, maybe Omar. When the officer came for me again, I was ready. He said they'd reconsidered my case. There would be hearings, appeals, decisions. But now, my name was my own again. Whatever future awaited me, it would not belong to a ghost. He looked at me carefully. "Do you regret it?" he asked. I thought for a long time before answering. "I regret what it cost," I said. "But I don't regret wanting to live." He nodded. "That's human," he said. They transferred me to a refugee reintegration center on the city's edge. Gray buildings, colder beds, but honest ground beneath them. Every morning, I volunteered in the kitchen, peeling potatoes, slicing bread, teaching new arrivals how to fill out forms without crying. When they asked my name, I told them the truth. No hesitation, no pause. And when they smiled and repeated it back to me, I realized something. Truth can be rebuilt from the sound of your own voice if you keep saying it long enough. Some nights, I still dream of the sea. The waves whisper both names, his and mine, like a single sentence. I don't try to separate them anymore. Maybe that's what forgiveness really is. Not erasing the lie, but carrying it gently until it stops hurting. When I was finally released, spring had begun to creep into the city. Not with warmth, but with permission. Pigeons returned to rooftops. The river thawed, moving slow and stubborn under the bridges. I walked out with a plastic bag of my belongings. 2 shirts, 1 photograph, and a letter written by a woman who had forgiven a man she'd never met. They didn't deport me. They didn't absolve me either. The papers said probationary stay, but to me, it read like a second chance carved out of gray ink. I found work at a community kitchen run by a local church. They didn't ask about my past. Maybe because everyone who comes there carries a version of it. Old men with foreign accents washed dishes beside me. Mothers from Sudan served soup to children from Ukraine. When the volunteers asked my name, I said it, my real one. And it felt like the room exhaled with me. I learned to live small again, to take the bus instead of the train, to spend my wages slowly, to find holiness in repetition. Wash, chop, stir, serve. Every bowl of lentils I ladled out felt like paying back a small portion of my debt to the world. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the metal pots, blurred, uneven, and I wonder which man is looking back. The refugee? The thief? The survivor? Maybe all of them. Maybe none. Maybe the truth lives in the space between what we were and what we pretended to be. Anya came once. Months later, she found me stacking crates in the back alley, wearing the same coat I'd owned since the factory. We stood there, quiet, the city breathing around us. "I heard what happened," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were searching for the man she thought she knew. "I'm not him," I said softly. She nodded. "I figured," she said. Then, after a long pause, "But you're someone now." She left before I could thank her for saying that. Some kindnesses are best left unfinished. They echo longer that way. I still write letters to Omar's family. I never send them. They begin the same way: "Dear sister, dear father, dear family of the name I borrowed." And they end the same way: "He is remembered, I promise you that." Because he is. Every time someone calls my name at the kitchen, every time I sign a form, every time I whisper a prayer, I think of the man who gave me permission to survive. Sometimes I walk to the sea. The same one that took him spared me. I stand by the water's edge and let the wind sting my face until memory feels like absolution. Seagulls circle above, laughing in a language without borders. I close my eyes and listen. The waves don't ask for documents. They don't care about names. They just return, again and again, relentless, forgiving, endless. I'm no saint. I'm no criminal either. I am the space between both, the unfinished story that kept breathing when it shouldn't have. The man who borrowed a name and somehow found his own inside it. Now, when the night is quiet and the city sleeps, I whisper my real name aloud, not as apology, not as confession, but as promise. To remember who I was, to honor who I became, and to forgive the man who had to steal a name just to stay alive. Some names are stolen, some are given, and some are earned. But the ones we keep, the ones that survive the storms, are the ones we whisper when no one is listening.